Conditioning for me is the acknowledgement that how we respond to our experience is learned, conditioned, and it can be changed towards what is more aligned with our values. So, for example, from frustration towards satisfaction, anxiety towards calm, anger towards kindness, and so forth. But not only these habits that relate to specifically to our happiness and suffering, but also skills, like not able to ride a bicycle to riding a bicycle, from procrastinating to be more productive, and so forth. The acknowledgement of conditioning gives us now the awareness that yes, I can change certain habits towards more alignment with my values internally, but also the habits that learned responses we see in our world, we have an opportunity to influence them. So I'm going to share my current theoretical understanding of conditioning. So let's begin with the specific conditionality, which you can also simply understand if this, then that. If this happens, then this happens. Me personally, I believe that everything is actually a conditioned, a learned response, a habit. So for example, internal our habits of anxiety or calm, but also externally, the whole universe is just an accumulation of conditionings. So for example, and these are simple examples. I know there are more complexities to it. But if we take water at a certain temperature, for example 100 degrees Celsius, starts to boil from liquid form towards gas. Below zero, it starts to freeze, go into solid form. So depending on the temperature, then this happens. Another example is the body. If I consume excessive calories above my bodily needs, then I will gain weight. If I consume insufficient calories below my bodily needs, then I will lose weight. If this happens, then this happens. So these are repeatable patterns that we can rely on, trust, like laws. An example about anger. For example, anger comes up if there's resistance towards our current experience, then anger might pop up. That's one possible scenario. Now, if I bring resistance towards the anger as well, I don't want to experience anger, I don't like it, then actually anger increases as the fuel, the nutriment, why anger is there in the first place is resistance. So the same way I could apply acceptance towards it, and with it, the decrease of resistance and anger will weaken or pause or drop altogether. Finally, an example of plants, which I use as an analogy. The plants will grow if the conditions are right, so there's fertile soil, humidity, sun, and water. If the conditions are right, it will grow, flourish. If the conditions are not right, then it might be weaken, die. So there you have some examples of specific conditionality applied to externally and internally, with the invitation now to be curious about what are the specific causes that lead to this. And then we can apply them to whatever we want to increase. We can then apply the causes. Whatever we want to decrease, we can also take away the causes. Plasticity for me is the idea of learned responses being able to be exchanged, replaced, removed, or weakened, maintained, or strengthened. I'm unsure whether all learned responses can be changed externally or internally. The ones relevant for happiness and suffering, though, I'm confident, as it's my own direct experience, they can be significantly changed. One example is the anger. When anger comes up, we let go of resistance, and with it, acceptance arises, bring it towards it, and then anger weakens. The same way when we stop watering the plant will weaken. The same way when we drop the temperature of the water boiling below 100, it will stop boiling. When does habit change occur? So my understanding, whenever the mind is responding to a sensory experience, it is habituating something. So now when is the mind responding to a sensory experience? So whenever the mind is aware of a sensory experience, it will automatically respond towards it. Hence, it is habituating something. So now when is the mind aware of a sensory experience? So I think all the waking hours, when we are awake, whether we are mindful or not. So this means whether we are aware of what our mind is aware of, or we're not aware of that, our mind is practicing something. The same way when I reflect upon my dreams, I notice this first-person experience, but I'm not mindful during the dreams. So this means that even though I'm not mindful, our mind is still responding towards the sensory experience created by the mind, and it is practicing habituating something. So when it comes about the intensity or degree of habit change, there are some dependencies. So I believe that in a very short amount of time, we can create huge changes. In a long amount of time, we can create little changes. And I believe this depends, one, on the unification of mind and on the relationship of acceptance or resistance towards it. So, for example, a negative example would be a traumatic experience where we experience abuse or violence and similar things. And in that situation, usually doesn't have to be, but the mind might experience a lot of danger, hence resistance towards it. So a lot of fear is active. So there the mind, as it relates to this experience as being dangerous, very significant towards your well-being, it habituates a strong response. The same way, for example, when we practice kindness, we can practice kindness with a unified mind where we attune to, are curious about, enjoy this practice, and the parts are all aligned with this intention of cultivating, being curious, experiencing kindness. Or we have a scattered mind, where only some parts of the mind are tending to this and other parts are a little bit more scattered. And hence, less parts of the mind, less power is there in order to cause habit change. About the manifestations of habit energy or conditioning. One manifestation is the frequency, how often it shows up. In the plant analogy, you can imagine it as how often the same plant is there. So we might have the response of fear in multiple scenarios, or the response of relaxation towards multiple sensory stimuli. Imagine that you, for example, practiced fear when a person criticizes you, or shame or anger. Now this response was conditioned within you now, practiced. And your mind is constantly thinking about, is this a similar situation where I should also respond in a similar way? And it might find one and then it practices it. So this bit by bit, the plants are spread around the forest. Then we also have the intensity. When the response is activated, how intense is it? Is it a strong fear or a weak fear? A strong sense of relaxation or a weak sense of relaxation? This depends also how much we've practiced it and how intense we've practiced it. Remember the traumatic experience? Strong sense. A strong sense of equanimity? Then we practice this habit. In the plant analogy, I see it as like the height of the plant. Maybe a huge tree that has matured, either practiced intensively or has been practiced over a long time repeatedly. So you cultivated this habit so it can grow. And then we also have the idea of the depth or the layer. And this relates to the specific conditionality. For example, let's take the sense of anger or safety. Anger requires resistance in order to be there. Now, without resistance, anger will weaken and then drop altogether at one point. So this means that anger is a superficial layer and resistance is a more deeper layer. The same way for the sense of safety, it requires acceptance. In the plant analogy, you can perceive it as the soil and the plants that come out of the soil. And the invitation here is to be curious about what are the prior causes, the deeper layers. Because as we work on the soil, on the deeper layers, it will then influence all the manifestations, consequences of it. Imagine you plant an apple tree, but it doesn't work so well because of the fertility of the soil is insufficient. Then you work on the fertility of the soil, and then you have a lot easier task at hand to cultivate that habit, that apple tree. The same way we want to change the resistance, for example, work on it, weaken it, so then all manifestations of resistance, such as anger, and any other, such as worry, fear, etc., they will weaken. One more aspect is potentiality, meaning that the habit, the conditioning, is waiting to be activated. It has this potential there and just waiting for the specific conditions to be activated. In the plant analogy, you can imagine that the plant is waiting for spring to arrive to bloom, and in winter, it more or less hibernates. This means that only because we do not experience certain responses, such as fear or anger, for example, does not mean that they're not there. They just may lie dormant. So an example in my case was that my prior living place, I experienced a lot of aversion, resistance towards sound outside my place. And from this resistance came anxiety and bodily tension, etc. And I decided to move away to another place. And for 1.5 years, I didn't have much sound aversion. But after 1.5 years, my mind's, this habit that I conditioned, the sound aversion, decided to take another object to be averse to and applied the same response of bodily tension, anxiety, etc. towards them. So for 1.5 years, this habit lied dormant and then bloomed. The spring came. So here's an invitation to not be deluded that only because a certain response is not happening for a while does not mean that we have overcome it, sufficiently weakened, or completely removed it. There's a saying that if you want to test if you're enlightened, in quote, you spend a week with your family and maybe even talk about politics to test whether simply you have removed the external conditions, even though the internal conditions are still there. And then if we confront, experience, come in contact with the external conditions again, you respond in a similar way. Now, this is not to say that we cannot weaken or completely remove certain habits. So for example, in my case, when it came about harshness towards myself, I would make the claim that I have overcome it. It didn't come up now for 4 years and had multiple scenarios, possibilities, opportunities for that habit to be practiced. So it seems like in the plant analogy, I've taken out the roots rather than trimming it where it comes back again after a while. The same way that happens with my thorn bush that I have outside. I've trimmed it already twice, but I've never took the root out. So it always comes back and grows. So we can weaken it and maintain weakening it. But then if we allow it to rise again, then it will grow. Or we can completely take out the root. And this takes a more deeper practice where we bring a lot of equanimity, acceptance towards that, as well as a combination of wisdom or understanding that this is not of the benefit for the mind. And with that, the mind completely lets go of that habit. And this happened with my harshness towards myself, where completely, like maybe it's still lying dormant, I have to wait. But there seemingly has been happening a disenchantment, an understanding of the disadvantage and of wanting to drop it. So of no benefit at all to be harsh towards myself, rather be kind. So this means we can weaken, but the potential remains, or we can completely remove it, but the potential is out. Now about practicing the habits that we want to weaken and the habits that we want to strengthen. With a curiosity towards what specific conditions are required. And one universal condition is resistance or acceptance. For example, when anger arises, which is based on resistance, what I do, I recognize, I release, and I enjoy. I recognize the excessive effort it takes to resist my current experience, the excessive effort it takes to practice anger. Then once I've recognized this, with a softening breath, I release the effort underlying anger and resistance. And as I release, there might arise a relief that I notice and enjoy. So by recognizing the effort underlying resistance and anger and noticing how exhausting, unpleasant, how it is to my disadvantage, I disenchant. I teach the mind the disadvantage of it, changing the fertility of the soil, making it more difficult for those plants then to survive in a less fertile soil. The plants, the habits of anger are based on resistance. Then with the softening breath, releasing the effort underlying, I stop watering that habit, not giving it further fuel. And by enjoying the relief, how nice it feels, I'm teaching the mind the advantage of this, how preferable it feels, changing the fertility of soil towards letting go acceptance. And with this, the anger, the habit of plant weakens because I stop watering it, as well as changing fertility of soil, the prior layer, the deeper layer. This is how I weaken habits that I want to weaken. Now, when we apply this to strengthening habits, I use the formula of activating, noticing it, softening into, and enjoying. I activate it, for example, kindness. May all beings be happy, truly meaning it. Then I notice how it manifests within body and mind, continuing to practicing, experiencing kindness. And I soften into it, allowing it to deepen, to grow, and then enjoying how nice it feels. By activating, noticing, and softening into, I water the plant, practicing it. Then by enjoying, I'm teaching the mind the benefit, how preferable and how nice it feels to experience kindness, changing the fertility of the soil. As well as on top of that, the softening into the experience is like a safety mechanism. As you noticed with the example of anger earlier, as we soften into the anger, releasing effort based on resistance, those habits will weaken. So as we soften into kindness, we make sure this is a habit not based on resistance, as well as allowing it to deepen, to grow within our body and mind. So this is how I practice weakening habits based on resistance and activating, strengthening habits that are based on acceptance. Some considerations regarding how to practice conditioning. One is the understanding that it is a gradual process. It depends on how often, the quantity we practice, the frequency, and the intensity, the quality. So I can practice kindness for 1 minute a day or 1 minute a year. It will make a difference. I can practice kindness for 3 hours a day, but with a scattered mind, or 20 minutes a day with a unified mind. This will make a difference. We cannot force this, so as we also provide conducive conditions for the plant, the soil, the sun, the humidity, etc. Whenever the plant is ready to grow, it will grow. What we can do is we can provide the conducive conditions and then allow the mind and body to do the rest. We can also be active about it or more passive about it. Active, I mean we can intentionally activate habits that we want to weaken and then weaken them, or we can intentionally activate habits that we want to strengthen them. Or we can also simply wait for life to trigger our responses. So whenever kindness or you receive a gift, you feel humbled, etc., appreciative, we can soften into it, practicing that habit. Or whenever a kind of habit of resistance, anger, whatever it might be, comes up, we can take the opportunity there to allow it to weaken, to update that habit. And also a warning. We can practice positive habits, the one we prefer to have, and negative habits, the one we do not want to have. I spent a long time in my meditation retreats, for example, in one occasion, 5.5 months, practicing resistance. And as I practiced resistance, I cultivated these plants, and big ones, within me, which I still bear the consequences from till this day, to a significantly lesser degree, as I've brought acceptance towards them, worked with them, but it's still there. What I want to say with this is that make sure that your quality is as good as it can be, rather than having a high quantity with low quality. You can go to the gym, but you can damage yourself, injure yourself, your quality is not good enough. So the invitation is to soften into our experience, for example, to make sure that we release the effort that is possible to release underlying our resistance as much as we can, and develop the skill of softness as our foundation, as well as other sources of quality such as guidance from an expert, etc. When it comes about daily life, we can distinguish between formal practice and informal practice. Formal practice being where most of our attention is towards the practice, so usually at home, but it doesn't need to be. An informal practice where most of our attention is towards the activity, for example, gardening, washing dishes, having a conversation, listening to this video. And in both scenarios, our mind is practicing. So in daily life, we want to take advantage of this period of time to also habituate the plans we want to habituate. Now in daily life, I think we have great opportunities because the conditions may be so specific that it activates certain responses that are not as easily accessible within formal practice. So we can take advantage of those when they arise, whatever it might be, weakening them or strengthening them. Or we can also intentionally activate them as you want. It's your daily life, but you have these opportunities there. Now, one thing is also that in daily life, as we cannot control as much the setting compared to formal practice where we're at home, safe, conducive environment, usually, hopefully. There might be some experiences that cause excessive resistance. Resistance is stress we cannot handle, and that's okay. That's why we have formal practice, to practice, cultivate our foundation, and then to bring it into daily life. The same way we go to practice in the gym, for example, to then have a marathon at one point. So the same way, if there are two difficult experiences in daily life, it is such that they're outside our control. We can do our steps to reduce those, but they might happen because life is outside our own control. But then in our formal practice, we can prepare so then our daily life, we can practice easier and easier and better and better. An invitation is to have indicators of progress or key performance indicators. Feel free to choose them. I share two of mine. One is that I want to weaken all habits that are based on resistance, pushing things away, holding on to things. And I want to condition habits, strengthen those that are based on acceptance. So for example, habits that are based on resistance are fear, anger, worry, jealousy, envy, greed, these kind of things. And habits that are based on acceptance, you can also directly experience them, is for example kindness, forgiveness, relaxation, calm, contentment, satisfaction. If you soften into them, they will deepen. If you soften into resistance, those habits will weaken. So this is one indicator of progress based on acceptance or resistance. Another indicator of progress I have is to have habits that align with my values. So this could be, for example, being productive rather than procrastinate. This could be being skilled in reasoning rather than unskilled in reasoning. Depending on your values that you have, cultivating those habits always on foundation of acceptance. These are my indicators for progress, but you might have other indicators for progress. In the end though, you want to have a gradual and at one point significant decrease of those habits you don't want to have, and an increase of those habits that you want to have. So this is my understanding of conditioning. Everything having a learned response, a potentiality within it, following if this then that, inside as well as outside. Now my task is to align those learned responses, transform them into the habits that I want to, based on acceptance and aligned with my values internally, then also influence the outside world towards them. So that I become a beautiful garden and the outside world is also a beautiful garden full of nutritious plants, strong and frequent.